introducing Olivia Porter, who has many strings to her bow, including, we were just talking about food, she's a very good source of knowledge on the eateries of London. So that's the most important thing about her. But academically, she did her BA in Sanskrit and Pali at Oxford, and then followed that with an MA in anthropology at the London School of Economics. And she has many languages, including expertise in Latin, which allows her to so I'm just going to mute a few people because of the echo. So, and works as a tutor teaching Latin. She's also worked on several research projects, including she's working on with me on the Red Cross project now on conflict-related sexual violence and Buddhism. She's a founding member of the Transnational Network of Theravada Studies, so the group we're currently meeting as part of, and she's the reviews editor of Contemporary Buddhism. But we're here today to hear her talk about her PhD research topic, in which she has been tracking down the Jyoti Buddhist practices of Burma and China. And so I hand over to Olivia, who's been doing an amazing job of doing an originally based PhD during lockdown. And we'll hear both the topic and also how she's gone about surviving PhD during lockdown. Olivia, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. Should I exit Spotlight?
I can do that for you.
Okay. Okay. And can everybody see the screen okay and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll start. So hello everyone, and thanks Kate for the introduction. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm really pleased to be giving a presentation for After the Rains, the series which I've really enjoyed being a part of this year. The title of my talk is The Tai Jyoti of the Myanmar-China Border. This talk is based on my PhD research, which focuses specifically on the Tai Jyoti Theravada tradition. So I'll just explain a few terms in case they might not be familiar.
Sorry, Olivia, I don't see the PowerPoint. I mean, is that supposed to appear now?
Oh, it should be up. Can you see it now?
No.
No? Let's see.
Oh, yes, now I can see it. I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
It's okay now?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, that's right. Okay, so where was I? So I'm just going to explain a few terms. So the group that are the focus of my research refer to themselves interchangeably as the Jyoti or the Tai Jyoti. The Jyoti get their name from their founder, the monk Jyoti. The Pali term Jyoti translates to light or radiance. There's no standard way of transliterating the Shan language, and the term Jyoti has been transliterated in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's spelt with a J or a TS, but I followed Dr. Jyotika Kalyan's transliteration, which uses the Z. The term Dai is the name, in the name Dai Jyoti refers to the Dai ethno-linguistic group known as the Shan in Myanmar. The Jyoti are a religious tradition closely associated with the Shan ethnic group. So, who are the Jyoti? The elusive Tai Jyoti tradition is found across the Myanmar-China border. With a reputation for strict and austere practices, it's been treated as peripheral to mainstream Shan Theravada in both scholarship and locally among the wider Shan monastic community. Until now, little has been known about the nature of their practices or their history outside of the group itself, despite being enigmatically mentioned in scholarship since the 19th century. The Tai Jyoti have been mentioned in writings on Burmese Buddhism as a heterodox, austere, and persecuted Shan tradition. But these references are never more than 1 or 2 sentences long. So, who are the Jyoti? How did they manage to remain under the radar for so long? And why is so little known? Although the Jyoti may seem underground, Jyoti communities are found throughout Myanmar and across the border in Derhong, China, and even further afield. This presentation aims to introduce the Jyoti tradition as it's practiced in contemporary Myanmar. I'll try and cover a brief historical mapping of the Jyoti tradition, but the main focus today will be on the contemporary tradition and practice. In this image on screen, which hopefully everybody can see, you can see some of the Jyoti novices on procession at the Poi Sang Long, the novice ordination ceremony in 2020. You can see that the novices are barefoot and they're walking on cloths that have been laid out from the main monastery all the way to the ordination hall. So, what has been written about the Jyoti? As I've mentioned before, the Tai Zawti have been mentioned sporadically in writings of Burmese Buddhism since the 19th century. However, there's very little literature that focuses solely on the Jyoti tradition. In some cases, the Jyoti have been inaccurately represented in Western academic literature. Most notably, the Jyoti have been mistaken as a Paramat sect by Father Sangamano, J.G. Scott, and E.M. Mendelssohn. The term Paramat refers to groups widely regarded as sectarian and unorthodox. These groups fell in and out of favour with the Burmese king Bodapaya in the 18th century. This singling out by Bodapaya might relate to Scott and Mendelssohn's confusion, as the Jyoti were also targeted by King Bodapaya. Since both the Paramats and the Jyoti were persecuted by Bodapaya, there must have been some conflation of the two groups as the same tradition. From Thanton's translation of the Royal Orders of Burma, we learn that the Jyoti were specifically targeted by Bodapaya. In September 1783, a royal order was announced which demanded that members of the Jyoti sect should be sent to the city for punishment, and those who allowed them to escape had silver, the silver that they'd taken as bribes, melted into their mouths. Which is quite striking because it makes us question if this was the punishment for the men who allowed the Jyoti to escape, and it was so extreme and violent, then what would the punishment have been for the Jyoti? One of the first references to the Jyoti in Western literature is from an account by the Catholic missionary Vincenzo Sangamano in 1893, who wrote, "Their religion is totally different from that of Gautama, and they acknowledge an omnipotent and omniscient Nat, the creator of the world. They despise the pagodas and the statues of Gautama." This account by Sangamano is mentioned in E.M. Mendelssohn's seminal work, Sangha and State, which was published in 1975, which remains one of the most extensive accounts of the Jyoti in academic literature, and it's about 8 pages long. It's from Mendelssohn's account that I formulated some of my initial research questions when I started learning more about the Jyoti tradition. And in this presentation, I'll use Mendelssohn's observations as a starting point to begin to explore and introduce the Jyoti tradition. While he was in Shan State, Mendelssohn was able to find some Jyoti followers and recorded that the Jyoti are very strict and do not mix with other monks. They use the Pali Tipitaka in Shan and wear the yellow robe. He notes that there were very few monks, and in all places but the headquarters, there were many Jyoti kyong, or monastery, but they don't have any monks. Mendelssohn describes the Jyoti as a late 18th century sect that survived after being chased out of Burma proper to the Shan states, and that a number of Shan Buddhist customs appear to have been adopted, with Shan texts and iconography. One of the most striking observations Mendelssohn makes is what he describes as the most interesting factor that remains, which is the concentration of Jyoti laymen in a few villages and the one monastery headquarters concept of leadership, which I'll begin to explore in this presentation. Drawing on just a few accounts of the Jyoti, we can see that the accounts of the Jyoti are quite brief and speculative, but in his overview, Mendelssohn raises a number of interesting questions. He alludes to the centrality of laymen within the tradition and how there are very few monks. He also mentions the one monastery headquarters of leadership feature in the Jyoti monastic organization. And again, these were some of my guiding questions when I began to learn more about the Jyoti. From spending time with the Jyoti lay people and lay practitioners known as Jalay, I'm able to engage with some of these questions and understand how they might be answered from a Jyoti perspective. It's also worth reiterating here that little is known about the Jyoti by the wider Shan and Burmese population. Shan scholar monks might be aware of the Jyoti tradition if they're interested in Shan traditional poetic literature called Liklong, which is usually composed and transmitted by the lay ritual practitioners I mentioned before, the Jalay, but also by monks. Liklong is a type of epic poetic literature that covers religious themes, usually, and the Jyoti have a reputation for being highly skilled in composing and transmitting Liklong. There are many famous Jalays from northern Shan State who are from the Jyoti tradition and acquired their Liklong training when they were ordained in the monastery. But in terms of visibility among the wider Shan and Burmese society, beyond Liklong, not much is known about the nature of the Jyoti or their practices or traditions. Dr. Jyotika Kuryan's written a number of articles about the Shan Liklong tradition and has emphasized the reputation that the Jyoti have for being highly skilled in Liklong literature and producing jalays in some of these articles. And his work was some of the first literature I read about the Jyoti, and it's because of his work that I had some understanding of the contemporary Jyoti in the initial stages of my PhD research. In this image on screen, you can see the jalay at the front. He's reciting Liklong on an Uposita day in a Jyoti Daiwat, in a Jyoti temple in a Jyoti village in southern Shan State. And this was the first Jyoti Daiwat I visited, and it's what sparked the rest of my PhD research. Next, I'll focus on the question, why is it that so little is known? So, why is so little known? There are a number of reasons why so little is known about the Jyoti tradition. The first being that the Jyoti have relocated many times. The frequent relocation throughout Myanmar and China means that there are small and sparsely located communities rather than multiple large and established monasteries or communities. This also ties in with the One Headquarters organization that Mendelssohn mentioned earlier. In the image on the slide, you can see the inside of the current main headquarters in Mungyang, or Mon Yin in Burmese. This is in Kachin State. Another factor is that the geography of the Shan states is very mountainous and it's difficult to travel around, which meant that communities remained quite isolated and they weren't easy to access for a long time. One of the most important factors is that the Jyoti monks in the lay community kept to themselves for a very long time. One of the enigmas of the Jyoti tradition, among those who might have heard of them, is that the Jyoti laity and monks don't engage with non-Jyoti monks, so they don't engage with mainstream Theravada monks. Anecdotally, I've heard different opinions on this matter. However, I have heard multiple times that this was the case in the past, but things are beginning to change, especially since the 1980s when the Jyoti were absorbed into the Thudhammā gaing, which resulted in more communication with central sangha authorities and representatives. But the idea behind the lack of communication in the past is related to the austere nature of the Jyoti and the perception that non-Jyoti monks are more lax in their practice of the Vinaya. Another reason why the Jyoti have not featured more in research is probably related to the lack of access to the region and language limitations on the behalf of researchers. So I hope these first few slides have provided a kind of comprehensive introduction to who the Jyoti are. And now I'm going to focus on a brief history of the Jyoti and add a little bit of historical context. So on the screen, you can see a brief Jyoti timeline. Back to Mendelssohn, he was able to discover that the Jyoti were an 18th century tradition, and he was told about one of the Jyoti abbots, Venerable Thudhammā, but he was unable to establish a Jyoti monastic lineage or learn more beyond these basic facts. The lack of information or sources that mention the Jyoti was a real issue at the initial stages of my research. Beyond the dates laid out in the royal orders of Burma, there was very little information that could be used to begin to establish a historic Jyoti timeline. This changed when I became aware of some key Jyoti texts written by the Jyoti community themselves. The first book, the first book I came across was the book on the far right. The title translates to the Golden Jubilee edition, the Lloyd Jyoti Temple in the town Mungyang, and was published in 2016. This book is a reprint of the middle book on the slide, which was published in 2003. Both of these books were published by the Jyoti monastic headquarters in Kyong Loi Jyoti. The temple is also referred to as the Panyalankara Jyoti Temple, which is the official Burmese name. But as we can see from the self-published text, the Jyoti refer to their headquarters as Kyong Loi Jyoti. The title of the yellow and green book on the left translates to About the Jyoti Tradition, its customs and religion, and was published in 1997 in Yangon, and its author is Sang Sam, who is a Jyoti layman. These texts are still used and read by the Jyoti community and offer a wealth of information that was previously unknown to me, including some background on the founding of the tradition, a monastic lineage, and other key dates and facts. Using these texts, I've drawn up a brief timeline, which hopefully will give a little insight into the historical mapping of the Jyoti tradition. So, from these texts, we learn that the founder of the tradition, Vajrayoti, was born in 1654 and ordained as a bhikkhu when he was 20 in 1674. He was discovered in a cave near Sagaing, which is near Mandalay, by a hunter who came across Vajrayoti sitting in meditation. Jyoti gave a sermon to the hunter, who then took him to the city where he began to preach. He established a group of 8 disciples who continued his lineage. What is not totally clear at this point is into which lineage Jyoti was originally ordained and which lineage the first 8 monks were originally ordained into. This is something that's quite important to explore because we know that there must be at least 5 bhikkhus present to carry out an ordination. So in order for Jyoti and his disciples to ordain new monks into their tradition, they would need 5 monks who were already bhikkhus. An account in the Kyongloi Jyoti text details that the initial 8 monks accepted Jyoti as their upajjhaya, the Pali term for preceptor, but it's not clear if they were actually reordained or if they just accepted Jyoti as their teacher and leader. This opens up questions regarding monastic lineages, the Burmese Sangha, and the lineage legitimacy. What is important to note here is that since the time of Jyoti in the late 17th century, it is possible to establish a continuous Jyoti monastic lineage until now. Their social and geographic isolation means that they bypassed various Burmese Sangha reforms. So for those interested in pre-reform Buddhism in Burma, the Jyoti may offer some interesting insights. From the royal orders, we can map out a few more key dates. These dates mark the persecution of the Jyoti, who were singled out by King Shin in 1763 and by Bodapaya in 1783. I've also included in this timeline a few of the key dates mapping out Jyoti migration throughout the Shan states and into Dehong in China. In 1777, the Jyoti settled in Loi Le in Dehong, which is in the China side, and they remained there for at least 82 years. This was the longest that they stayed in one place since the inception of the tradition. From 1859 onwards, the Jyoti relocated many times, moving around Shan State and remaining in one place for a few years before moving on to somewhere new. The frequent relocation of the monastery headquarters has resulted in a network of small Jyoti communities throughout Shan State and into Mandalay and Kachin State, and even further afield into China, and there's also a community in Yangon. The Jyoti stopped in Meng'yang, in Monyin, where the headquarters is now, multiple times, the first being in 1909, but in 1966 they settled there, and that's where they've been ever since. And it's where they celebrate the Triannual Novice Ordination ceremony, and it's where all the Jyoti monks are trained and where they all reside. A notable date that I've also included in this timeline is that the Jyoti were absorbed into the Thudhammā gaing, the largest of the 9 official gaing in Myanmar, in 1980, during the Sangha reforms implemented by the Ne Win period of government. This has had important implications since the Jyoti now have had more interaction with the central Burmese Sangha and are expected to uphold some of the expectations of a Thudhammā monastery. This is why the Jyoti monastery now has a Burmese name, the Panyalankara monastery, and has to conform to things like a state Sangha approved monastic curriculum. Next, I'm going to draw on the relocation of the monastic headquarters to explore the different Jyoti communities across Myanmar and China. So where are the Jyoti based? Again, I refer back to one of Mendelssohn's observations that impacted my initial research. Mendelssohn recorded, there are very few monks, about 100 in the northern Shan states. I don't know about the other parts. The Jyoti live mostly in Momiek, in Mungmit, Senwi, and Namkham. From this excerpt, and from talking to local scholar monks in southern Shan State, I originally was under the impression that the Jyoti were based in northern Shan State. When I went to attend a Liklong recitation ceremony on Utposita Day in a village in southern Shan State, I was extremely surprised to find out that the village was, in fact, a Jyoti village, and the Liklong recitation was taking place inside a Jyoti Daiwat. From there, with the help of the scholar monks at Shan State Buddhist University, I was able to establish some more Jyoti contacts. I visited some Jyoti Jalai in Laika in southern Shan State and visited 2 of their Daiwat there. It just so happened that the Jalai that I met in Laika was actually on the front cover of one of the books that I had already seen. So if you can see at the bottom, there's a novice who's holding the umbrella for the abbot, and this was the Jalai that I met in Laika by chance. So from these conversations, I learned more about the extent of the network, and I went to the headquarters in Meng'yang in Monyin, and I talked with the Gobaga, the lay committee there. And when I was there, I was really struck by the different regions that everybody had come from, which seemed to be from all over the place. So in Monyin in Mungyang, when I was there, I was told that most of the villages around the monastery were Jyoti Shan villages. But I was surprised when I was told that there was also a Mandalay branch and the community spread throughout southern Shan State as well as in Yangon. At the event, there were also Malays from Dehong in China who had close ties with the Mungyang headquarters and spoke of an active community that still exists over the border in Dehong. In this map on screen, I've begun to pin some of the places where there are current active Dai Wat or Jyoti communities. As you can see, they are clustered in northern Shan State, but also down into southern Shan State and in China. And there's also a Jyoti community a lot further south in Yangon, but it wouldn't fit on screen. Dr. Jyotika Kayan and we've been working on a map locating all of the different places where the Jyoti have established their headquarters. But this has proved to be quite difficult because many of the villages and local Shan names of places aren't on Google Maps and they have local names and official names. So they're quite hard to locate. The takeaway point here is that for a seemingly underground group, there are multiple locations and communities spread over quite a large area. The communities in these locations have existed since the early 18th century, but until now, at least in the existing Western literature, the locations of these Jyoti communities has remained relatively unknown. So here I've mapped out a network of contemporary Jyoti communities, and now I'm going to turn to an event which brings all of the groups together, which is the Triannual Poi Sanglong Novice Ordination Ceremony. So the Poi Sanglong. The Poi Sanglong Novice Ordination Ceremony that I attended and we'll be talking about today was held from the 2nd to the 8th of February 2020 at the Jyoti Monastic headquarters in Monyin, which is in Kachin State. It was the 22nd Sanglong Ordination Festival to be held at the monastery in Mungyang. For a week-long period, over 6,000 Jyoti followers eat, sleep, worship, and pray together. This large festival brings together thousands of people from across the country and across the China border. It's striking that the Jyoti have seemingly been underground for so long, when in reality they are organizing major events which they're really quite open about. The Poi Sanglong is a novice ordination ceremony. These types of ceremonies happen all over Southeast Asia, where young boys reenact Prince Siddhartha's journey from being a prince to renouncing the world and becoming a monk. The Sanglong ordination ceremony is the young boy's first time being ordained into the monastic order, and it's usually temporary, ranging from a few weeks or a few years until the boys turn 20 and they can take full ordination. In the wider Shan culture, novice ordination is a coming-of-age ceremony and is an important time for families to make merit and celebrate Shan culture and identity. The Jyoti Sanglong ordination ceremony shares some similarities with mainstream Shan practice, but there are some distinct differences. So, at the 2020 Poi Sanglong, there were 170 boys being ordained as novices. The boys were split into 6 groups, and each day around 30 boys were ordained. At each triannual ceremony, there are 2 batches of Sanglong, of novices. The large-scale event, which is the one that I attended, is called a Kap Long, a big batch, and it takes place during the 3rd month of the Shan lunar calendar, about 3 months before Vasa, the rains retreat period. This is usually followed by a Kap On, a small batch, which takes place during the 6th month of the Shan lunar calendar. This batch is much smaller and takes place during the school holidays. The need for 2 batches is related to education levels. After the ordination ceremony, the Sanglong become novices. Most of their days are spent studying Shan and Burmese texts, and the Jyoti are known for quite strict and rigorous monastic training. In order to ensure that all of the boys are able to successfully master the texts and get the most out of their time spent in the monastery, they're split into these 2 groups, the Kap Long and the Kap On, based on education levels. The big batch ordain earlier because they need more time to get acquainted with monastic education. Boys who have studied up to standard 6, which is around 13 years old, and have a good grasp of reading and writing will join the small batch, since they need less time and less intensive study to get up to speed with the required texts for novices. The ceremony for the small batch is nowhere near as large or grand as it is for the large batch, which is usually about 50 boys ordaining, but sometimes it can be as few as 3. So in the image on the left is a Sanglong novice, and he's with his father. And they come from Kyokme in Myanmar. And the boy was planning to stay in the monastery in Mungyang for at least a year, and he had permission from his school to do this. Here he is on the procession that leads from the main monastery to the ordination hall. On this procession, the boys are covered with decorated umbrellas, and the onlookers throw puffed rice at them in celebration. This sanglong is dressed in pink, but as you can see in the other two images, there are sanglong dressed in yellow and in green. On each day of the festival, the boys wore a different colour outfit. So on one day, all of them would be wearing pink, the next day yellow, and so on. The sanglong get dressed inside of the monastery, and a makeup artist is employed to give the boys matching makeup. The outfits are the same, the makeup is the same, everything is matching, down to their velvet slippers. You can see on the sanglong dressed in pink, there's a green badge which has a number printed on it and is attached to his chest. This indicates his position in the procession. The procession of boys is organised by height order, so the tallest boy goes first. And in other Shan and Burmese novice ordination ceremonies, the novices usually wear whatever their parents or their sponsors have brought for them, and they don't need to match. They might also be carried by relatives or go on horseback during the procession. Some even go on elephants. But the Jyoti don't think that this is appropriate, and the boys must walk the procession. This is also related to the age of the Jyoti sanglong, which is supposed to be 13 or older. So the boys are too big to be carried. You also find a wider range of ages at the Jyoti sanglong ceremony. Some of them are quite old, in their late teens, because of the infrequency of the ordination ceremony. It takes place only once every 3 years. So the age of the sanglong will depend on when it coincides with the timing of the festival. Another reason why the festival takes place so infrequently is related to the costs involved in ordaining a sanglong. The 3-year time period gives parents the opportunity to save up so they can afford the cost of the robes, the donation, and the sponsorship of their sons at the temple. The center image is the break time after the procession and before the ordination ceremony itself. Lay people fill the bowls, these big bowls, with snacks and drinks for the boys to eat. The procession, when they walk from the monastery to the ordination hall, takes over an hour, and it's in the heat of the sun, so the boys are probably quite tired and they need to regain their energy and have a break. And the image on the right is the ceremony itself, where the sanglong are initiated and become novices. The older novices sit in front of them and help them with various recitations and changing into the orange robe at the end of the ceremony. You can also see at the back of this image the Joti Abbot and his right hand and left hand monk. They're sitting on the raised chairs facing out to the audience. Then I'll go to my next slide. So I don't have time today in this presentation to cover the Poi Sanglong in great detail, but there are a few brief points I'd like to make. The first is that, as you can see in the image on the left, it's not only the Shan that send their sons to be ordained at the monastery in Myanmar. From the image on the left, you can see a family from the Palang ethnic group. This challenges any assumptions that there might be about the ethno-religious identity of the Jyoti, and it's something that I'm looking to explore in more detail. Another point is that the Poi Sanglong is an opportunity to make merit. In the picture in the middle, you can see some laywomen giving donations, which are recorded and announced on a tannoy at the festival. Usually Jyoti communities that live far away from the headquarters in Myanmar will give their donations to the local Jalay in their village or their town, who will then go to visit Myanmar and pass on their offerings. By attending the Poi Sanglong, it's a nice opportunity for lots of lay people to be more involved in the donation process. A feature of the Jyoti tradition is that Jalays are always the intermediary between lay people and the monks, who have no direct contact with lay people. So whilst here the donation still goes through a Jalay, it's perhaps a different type of donation experience. The Poi Sanglong is also an opportunity to listen to Liklong recitations, and a chance for Jalay from all over the region to perform in front of a large crowd. The types of recitation given are mainly religious in nature, on topics such as the Jataka stories or meditation. And the Jalays who give the Liklong recitations are all men, but the majority of the audience, as you can see in this picture, are women. The role of the Jalay and Liklong in the Jyoti tradition is very important, and it's something that is very distinctive of the Jyoti tradition. So that's about the Poi Sanglong, and next I'm going to focus more specifically on the Jyoti monastic tradition. I'll just drink some water. Okay, so Jyoti monastic practice. again, I'm going to turn to another question raised by Mendelssohn in Sangha State, which is, why are there so few Jyoti monks? When Mendelssohn conducted fieldwork in the late 1950s, he noted that there were no more than 30 to 40 Jyoti monks. I assume this refers to fully ordained bhikkhus, but he doesn't specify exactly. As of 2020, there were 15 bhikkhus and 48 novices, and the number of monks remains very low. So why are there so few monks? There are a number of reasons why there are so few monks, but today I'll focus specifically on one reason, which is, to put it simply, that it's very hard being a Jyoti monk. The expectations and the rules of Jyoti monks adhere to and live up to are very strict and austere, and this is the reputation that they have from non-Jyoti people. Some of these rules include never handling money, never using transportation other than by boat. They never wear slippers or shoes. They live only within the headquarters in Myanmar. They're not able to use a mobile phone, listen to modern music, or read books on anything other than religious material. The inability to use any type of road vehicle greatly limits the extent to which the Jyoti monks can travel. Wherever they go must be walking distance, unless they travel by boat. And this is an interesting point given the Jyoti's history of frequent migration throughout the famously difficult to traverse region. In the image on the left, you can see the abbot of Kyong Loy Jyoti, the Jyoti abbot. He's about to step on a devotee. This tradition is a reenactment of the story of Sametha, in which Sametha offers his body as a bridge to the Buddha to walk over. If you can see just above the abbot, there's a yellow curtain on the stage. The curtain is used during public ceremonies to allow monks to compose themselves in privacy during long ceremonies. So at some points during the ceremony, the curtain will be drawn down and the monks are separated from the view of the audience. This use of the curtain is quite striking, and as far as I'm aware, is not practiced in mainstream Shan Theravada. When you first hear about some of these practices, they might not seem surprising, given that they're really just following the Vinaya, or the monastic rules laid out in the Pali canon for monks. But in reality, in modern Myanmar, most monks have adapted to some extent to modern life. And some of these rules have been relaxed. For example, it's not uncommon to see monks wear slippers or handle money or use a smartphone. In comparison to such monks, the Jyoti monks definitely seem far stricter. The Jyoti monks take the Vinaya very seriously and follow it as closely as they can. When we consider the strictness of the Jyoti monks, we can begin to understand why the Jyoti might be considered extremist, but also why they might not have had an easy relationship with the wider Burmese and Shan Sangha. Perhaps the close adherence of the Jyoti monks to the Vinaya highlights the comparative laxity of non-Jyoti monks. But it's not only the Jyoti monks that have a reputation for being strict, it's also the lay people. So now I'm going to talk about some of the Jyoti lay practices. Among those who have heard of the Jyoti, there's also an understanding that the Jyoti laity are very strict in their practices too. One Jalay from Laika in southern Shan state said that he was asked by a non-Jyoti Shan person if he was a Christian. They thought that because he didn't have Buddha images in his home, he couldn't have been a Buddhist. Traditionally, Jyoti lay people did not keep Buddha images in their home, as they thought that it was inappropriate to have them anywhere other than in the temple. One reason for this is that traditional Shan homes are tall structures made from wood, and when you walk around the home, the floor shakes. It would be disrespectful to keep a Buddha image on such shaky ground. The home is also the site of normal family affairs and marital relations, swearing, speaking badly of people, and all the rest of lay life, which makes it inappropriate, an inappropriate place for a Buddha image to be housed in the same place as such mundane things. So instead of keeping images on the altar, the Jyoti would keep liklong, this literature text. As you can see in the image on the right, inside the altar, there are liklong texts which are bound in cloth. Flowers are offered to the altar and prayers are recited in front of it in the morning and evening. And here again, we can begin to see the importance of liklong in the Shan tradition, in the Shan Jyoti tradition. So the image on the left is inside a Jyoti Daiwa temple in Panglong in southern Shan state. Here you can see there's a step up to a higher level in the temple where you can see there's a monk and a gelei. This is where the men sit and women remain on the lower level. The separation of men and women in the temple setting is not unheard of or uncommon in Burmese or Shan Theravada, but the distinction of this raised level is quite old-fashioned. And the Jyoti laity are very strict in their adherence of the 5 precepts. They don't consume alcohol, they don't buy live animals at the market, they only buy meat that's already been butchered. They can't engage in livelihoods that include any type of harm, for example, being a butcher or being a porter for goods like alcohol or weapons. And they can't be involved in the selling of goods like knives or matches. The prohibition about not selling matches is related to the possibility that a match could be involved in a fire, and a fire can cause the destruction of Buddhist texts, images, or materials. So in order to make sure that you're never implicated in such destruction, you should abstain from selling things that could be the cause of that type of thing. So refraining from such livelihoods reflects a strict adherence to the precepts which are to abstain from taking life and to abstain from intoxicating substances. Another striking feature of the Jyoti lay practice is how they dispose of food and flower offerings after they've been offered to a Buddha image in the temple. They must be ritually disposed of in a pit called Lukthan Som, which you can see in the image on the screen. Every Jyoti Daiwat has one of these pits. In Sri Lanka, Buddhists also refrain from eating food that's been offered to the Buddha image. It's possible that the Sri Lankan practice was a means of differentiating their practice from Hindu worship, as Hindus do eat food that has been offered to the gods. Perhaps the Jyoti practice is also a means of differentiating themselves from another tradition, as the mainstream Shan and Burmese Buddhists do not have an issue with eating food that's been offered to the Buddha image. Again, here we see a Jyoti practice that errs on the side of austere and can be seen as divergent from mainstream Theravada practice in Myanmar. Whilst the Jyoti have been labelled as heretical or unorthodox because of their apparently extremist practices, in fact, what we see is that the Jyoti are actually just very orthodox. The laity really follow the 5 precepts closely, and the monks follow the Vinaya as it's laid out in the canon. Again, perhaps it's not a question of how extreme the Jyoti are, but how their very close reading of the precepts and the Vinaya threatens to challenge the legitimacy of other more mainstream groups. So, as I've come to the end of my talk, I hope I've been able to provide a brief introduction to the Jyoti tradition. There are still so many topics to consider that I haven't been able to cover today. This includes the role of the gelei and the importance of liklong in the Jyoti tradition, as well as an exploration of Dai identity, especially in terms of transnational identity making and maintenance. I'd also like to consider the motivation to ordain as a Jyoti monk, especially in today's society. It's also necessary to consider what aspects of the tradition have remained the same and what has changed and why. And there's still so much about the history and the practices of the Jyoti that remain unclear. But what is clear is that it's a living tradition with a vibrant and enthusiastic monastic and lay community who are actively engaged in producing and maintaining their own specialized literature and customs. So thanks everybody for listening to my talk, and that's the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Olivia. That was excellent, fascinating talk. We're now going to open for questions. If you have a question, you can ask either by tapping the hand icon on the floating menu bar, and I will call on you to speak, or you can type your question into the chat. So please go ahead. Maybe while everyone is getting their question ready, I'll ask something. Olivia, you talked quite a bit in the beginning about the historiography of the Jyoti. Can you explain who exactly is calling the Jyoti heretical and extreme? Is this something, or what's the extent that there is, historical records that use those words, and the extent that other people have secondarily kind of picked that up and run with it in the historiography?
Yeah, so Mendelssohn in Sangha and State, which is probably the most extensive account of the Jyoti. I mean, other people have written about the Jyoti, but his is kind of what I've used to branch off with other questions. He calls the Jyoti heretical, and unorthodox is used, I think, by Father Sanghamahanayaka. So these early accounts, Mendelssohn uses these old accounts by J.G. Scott and Father Sanghamahanayaka.
So what year is Mendelssohn again?
Mendelssohn did his fieldwork in the 1950s, but Sangha and State wasn't published until I think 1975.
Okay, so it's relatively recent.
Yeah.
But Sanghamana is much older, right?
Yeah, that's the 1800s. But also it's locally among the Shan scholar monks. When I was in Shan State, they describe the Jyoti as extremists, because their practices are quite extreme compared to other mainstream Shan Theravada practices. So it's in the academic literature, but also locally, there's this perception, and that type of language is used to describe the Jyoti.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Kate, please ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks for a really interesting and very clear talk, Olivia. I have a couple of questions, but my question relates to the map. Could you go back to the map in the slideshow, please?
This one?
Yes. So you mentioned travel is only allowed by, unless you're on foot, is only allowed by boat.
Yeah.
I can see the Irrawaddy in that, but are river networks relevant to the spread? So that's part of my question. And here on the map, the Dehong region looks so connected to the other regions. Could you tell us a bit about the presence of Jyoti in Dehong, what you know about that?
Yeah, so the river question is a really interesting one, and is something that me and Jyotika are like considering and exploring. We've been trying to use Google Maps to see if the river is something that they could have used to migrate to all the different places that we've read about, and we're still not sure. Definitely the travel from the north to Yangon could have been by boat, but again they could have walked, we're just not sure. And then the question of over on the Dehong side, yeah, there are small communities throughout this region in Dehong, and they have their own Gobaga, their own lay committee, where they'll have Jalays in each village or town who will come over to Mungyang, and they'll give offerings, exchange texts, things like that. Honestly, I don't know too much at this point about the different types of communities in China. But what I do know is the sense that I got from speaking with some of the Jalays from the China side is that the border doesn't really mean much to them. They're very conscious of the kind of actually I don't know how to describe it. For them, their identity is that they are Dai. So for them, crossing a border is kind of meaningless in the sense, they're not thinking about, oh, I'm on the China side, so my practice is going to be different to what it would be like on the Myanmar side. It's kind of fluid, the exchange and the travel. So I don't think that the communities on the China side would see themselves as any different from the communities on the Myanmar side. It's as if they're all the same. But I think there's quite a thriving community there, because they still send boys to be ordained at the Sanglong ordination ceremony, and they still have Jalays being trained there as well.
Is there any difference in terms of, when people can take novice ordination, in terms of permissions, for example, or where it fits in with their school life or anything like that?
I think it's a decision that the parents make. From some of the parents that I talked to, they did get permission from the school, but also the quality of education that the novices receive when they're at the monastery in Mungyang is very high. So I don't think they're worried about the boys missing school. And also that it just depends how long they're going to be ordained for as well. Some boys at the novice ordination that I attended, they were only going to be there for 10 days ordained. So some would stay for a year, even longer than a year, and some it was a very short ordination. So yeah, it just depends on the family, depends on the parents, and each individual situation.
Great, thank you.
Okay, there's a question from the chat from Jay. She says, thank you for a great talk, Olivia. Is there any ordination for nuns in the Jyoti tradition?
There are no Jyoti nuns. There are only monks, only boys are ordained, so no.
I have another question. So you use the term headquarters instead of monastery. So I assume there's a differentiation here.
Yeah, I think it's because they only have one place where everyone is ordained, where all of the novices and monks are ordained, and where all of the monks live. So in the past, they did have multiple monasteries with active monastic communities, but at least since the 60s, there's only one location where all of the boys are ordained, and it's like the hub of all of the activity, basically.
So on the map, for instance, so many of the marked places, there are actually no monks.
There's no monks anywhere except in the headquarters.
Only in the headquarters.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So in the other places, so the other places, it's Jalay, who is the lead religious figure.
Exactly. Yeah. So I kind of alluded to in my talk, but I didn't really get to talk about, is that's why Jalays are so important to the Jyoti tradition, because there are so few monks, and because all of the monks are in Myanmar. It's the Jalays who do most of the work elsewhere. They lead the ceremonies. They're the intermediaries between the lay people and the monks, and they serve a very important role.
So only very rare ceremonies that lay people will require will actually involve monks?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. From Bruno, apologies if you've already made this clear. My internet might have cut out at a vital point. But how central is the one monastery relative to the community distribution you plotted on slide 6? Do we have a sense of what factors decided the location when it was eventually founded after the period of relocation and dispersal?
Okay, so thanks for the question. The one monastery headquarters is super important. It's the hub. It's where everything goes on. It's where all of the communication. It's where all of the major festivals and rituals occur. And multiple times a year, I think it's twice a year, but I could be wrong, the Jalays from all the different regions. So these are just a few places that are mapped out on the map, but there are more smaller Jyoti communities. They'll have a Jalay in these villages as well. Twice a year, they all go back to Myanmar, and they'll all give donations, receive more training, have exchange knowledge, and they use that as their base. So I'd say it is really important for them, the headquarters. And how did they decide on Myanmar as the headquarters? That is a really good question, and it's something that I've been trying to explore as well. What we do know is that they'd been to Myanmar before. They'd been to Myanmar in the early 1900s, before they settled there in 1966. And the question with the Jyoti is, there's the broader question, which is why did they relocate so many times? You know, there's different responses. There's some responses which is that they wanted to spread the message as far as they could, which is why they moved on all of the time to different communities. There's also the question of, were they pushed out of these different communities, and did they have to leave? And that's why they had to move so many times. So why would they pick Myanmar? That is a good question. I think it's difficult, and I'm not sure of the answer yet, because there are so many different spheres of influence and power within this region, and there's questions of things like where can they perform legitimate ordinations, what type of sema do they need, all these types of things, which are probably factors which impacted why they decided on Myanmar in the end. I'm not sure exactly why they chose Myanmar, but we know that they already had an established kind of connection with the region before they decided to put their roots down and have their monastery there since the 1960s. So yeah, it's something that I need to try and work out. I'm not sure at the moment.
We have another question in the chat. Thank you, Olivia, for such a great talk, very informative, from Purva. What do the rest of non-Jyoti sects think of the Jyotis? are there any political / ideological / historical reasons for their isolation? How are they so popular with their followers despite being so isolated?
Thank you for these questions. These are, really interesting. What do the rest of the non-Jyoti sects think of the Jyotis? So there's mixed responses, of course, depending on who you ask. I've heard a number of different opinions and responses. I think there's different splits. First of all, most people haven't heard of them. I think that would be the number one response. They don't know who they are. Then among those who do know who the Jyoti are, which is perhaps more likely to be Shan people and Shan monks, they think that the Jyoti are super extreme. They think that they are, like I mentioned before, that they're very austere, that they are very strict in their practices, to the point where it's too much. But they are known for being very skilled in long literature. So I think there's definitely like a huge respect for the Jyoti because they are so skilled at this type of poetic literature. But I think there's also just perhaps they have been misunderstood in the past because they have some of these practices. Like, one of the misconceptions about the Jyoti is that non-Jyoti thought that Jyoti monks and Jyoti lay people didn't respect non-Jyoti monks. So this could be related to why there might be some kind of, I wouldn't say negative feeling, but maybe misconceptions about what the Jyoti monks and laity are like. So yeah, they see them as a different type of group that follow a very strict practice, but at the end of the day they are all Theravada groups, and I think that's like understood and that's acknowledged. They all ultimately are Theravada, but they have just their own kind of unique divergence. And yeah, they're known for this type of long literature. So the Jalays that are famous in Shan state at the moment, lots of them are Jyoti, so they would have heard of Jyoti and they would respect them for the type of literature. Are there any political, ideological, historical reasons for their isolation? Yes. So especially during the 18th century, this is something that I'm hoping to explore more. I mentioned they were persecuted by Bodapaya, they were driven out, and then they migrated multiple times throughout the Shan states. You could interpret this as they were avoiding central authority and central power and avoiding communication with the central Burmese Sangha. But I need to do more work into really understanding the history of that and the reasoning and the dates to see if it all adds up. But yeah, I would say that there is definitely probably some political, ideological reasons for this isolation. And like Mendelssohn says, they were pushed out into the Shan states. So originally, Jyoti is from Sagaing, which is in Mandalay, which is kind of like central Burma. And he was of Burmese and in the text it says Burmese and Chinese ancestry, but it's not clear if this is Dai from the China side. But either way, he was in central Burma and he spoke Burmese. And it was a Burmese tradition which got pushed out into the Shan states and adopted a lot of Shan practices. So yeah, that's something that's worth considering. And how are they so popular with their followers despite being so isolated? It's a cultural tradition, as in most people are born into Jyoti families, and that's what they practice and that's what they know. And this frequent relocation meant that historically families would move with the monks to the different places that they would establish monasteries in the monastery in for a few years at a time. So yeah, I think it's something that the followers are born into, and it's what they practice and it's what they know. And yeah, I think that's probably one reason why they're so popular with their followers. But yeah, that's an interesting question, something that I should look into a little bit more. And then I can see there's a question from Kate, which is how many novices go on to bhikkhu ordination? Not very many. So say the Sanglong novice ordination ceremony that I went to, it was 170 boys being ordained as novices, yet there are only around 45 full-time novices at the monastery. So you can see there's quite a large discrepancy. Not many go on to be fully ordained bhikkhus, which is why there are so few Jyoti monks.
I have a couple of questions. Okay, first is that you talked about, okay, so the reputation for extremeness. So you had mentioned in your talk about the specific ways that they adhere, the monks adhere to the Vinaya. And also you had mentioned at one point that the lay people also adhere to the 5 precepts. So when the lay people adhere to the 5 precepts, is that all the time or only during the Boy Sangha?
All the time.
Wow, all the time.
All the
time.
My
God.
But, yeah, that's why they have this reputation for being very strict, to the point where they take the abstaining from intoxicating substances super seriously. So in Shan State, lots of people eat pickled mustard greens. They're like pickles. And sometimes these pickles are fermented to the point where I guess like the fluid or the liquid turns into an alcohol. And the Jyoti won't eat any pickles that get to that level or that stage, because that's how serious they take not consuming alcohol. So they don't, they're always following the 5 precepts. They don't consume alcohol, yeah.
Okay, I have another question. So you had mentioned that the jalay of the Jyoti had become well known outside of Jyoti community. So how did this happen? How did their literature and their recitation, and how did that flow outside of these isolated communities?
I'm not so from conversations with scholar monks in Shan State and with Jyotika, I've learned that these jalays are really famous in Shan State, but I'm not sure if people are aware that these jalays are Jyoti. They might not know. They might be really famous, but they might not know that they have a Jyoti background or Jyoti training. And I'd say one of the reasons why they're so popular, or why this type of literature is popular, is because it's across all Shan groups. So, or at least across southern Shan State with the Dailong group, they recite in the same language, the same styles, the same types of themes. So it's something that crosses boundaries, as in their Liklong is not only about the Jyoti community and the Jyoti belief and tradition. They transmit and recite Liklong that covers all sorts of topics, modern, old, religious, non-religious. So yeah, it's something that everybody can be enthusiastic about and enjoy.
How exactly is it? How precisely is the means of transmission? In other words, like, are there texts that are printed and shared to different groups, or recordings made of jalay performances, or do the jalay participate in ceremonies of non-Jyoti people? That's what I'm wondering.
Are you wondering if non-Jyoti people listen to the Jyoti jalays?
Yeah, we talk about Jyoti as being quite isolated. Like how are people even aware of these great jalays and their literature?
I think the kind of wider point that I'm trying to make in my research and in this presentation is that they've been seemingly underground for so long, especially how they're depicted in the Western literature, but they are everywhere. Well, they're not everywhere, but there's lots of communities and they're not hidden at all. So they're underground, but you can find a Jyoti jalay performing Liklong on Facebook or on YouTube. You know, you can see recordings elsewhere. So yeah, it's a good point, and it's a point that I try and explore, which is that for a group that seem to be so underground, they're really popular with their jalays and their Liklong. And yeah, the point I tried to make before was that people will listen to Liklong recitations, but they might not be aware that it's a Jyoti jalay that's reciting it.
I see. Okay. Thanks. Okay, another question on the chat. Are there any other particularly strict attitudes to food, e.g. how so-called medicine is interpreted in the evening, or is it that the same as for other monks? Do we know anything about meditation practice?
I'm not too sure about strict attitudes to food. I know that there are strict attitudes in the preparation of food offerings to Buddha images within the Jyoti tradition. So when the ladies in the Jyoti monastery in Mungyang, there's a lady who's she's called Nai Hun Som. She's the older lady who lives in the monastery and prepares all of the food. They take their food preparation very seriously, and they cover all of their hair in hair nets to make sure that nothing falls into the food, and they take a lot of care and attention with the food. They cover it up in nice cloths as soon as it's been prepared to make sure no dirt or dust or bugs get into the food. So yeah, they're quite strict in that sense in how they prepare food that will be offered to Buddha images. I'm not quite sure about how medicine is interpreted. I would assume that the monks are quite strict in not eating after midday, but I'm not too sure. And do we know anything about the meditation practice? The Jyoti are known for being very strict in their meditation, and I think Jyotika would be better at answering this question. He knows more about the meditation. I'm not too sure. I think they do have their own distinct practice, but I don't know the full details, so I don't feel confident talking about it. But I do think they do have their own meditation practice.
Okay, I have one last question, and if anyone else has a question, please prepare or raise your hand. Otherwise, we probably will wind up soon. And that is that you mentioned about, because the monks are basically at the headquarters and not really in the communities. What are the kinds of merit-making activities that lay people have? Since I think in most places the monks are the recipients of many activities that lay people do to make merit.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was quite surprised when I went to the first Jyoti Daiwa. They invite non-Jyoti monks into their Daiwa. So the villages and communities that are far away from the headquarters, they do invite non-Jyoti monks to perform some rituals for them. So I guess that's an opportunity to make merit. They also send donations with the gelei. So they'll give a donation to the gelei, and the gelei will kind of give it to the headquarters on their behalf, which I suppose is another way for them to make merit. But yeah, it is an interesting question, because they do seem quite austere in their kind of.
Oh, I see you as frozen right now. Is it just me, or?
No, it's for all of us. I think so. King's College internet has just frozen.
Oh no.
But perhaps we could take this opportunity just to let people know about the last talk in the series, which I've just put into the chat. So on the third Friday of July, which is the 16th of July, Tony Scott will be giving a talk on the Milinda Punha and the 5th and 6th councils in Myanmar. Sorry, I think Olivia's back, so we can go back to Olivia.
Oh, great. Yeah, sorry, Olivia, you were frozen, and you were talking about the communities invite the non-Jyoti monks into their communities to do some ceremonies.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, I don't know what exactly where I got when I froze. Yeah, so they invite non-Jyoti monks to their Daiwa, their small temples that don't have resident Jyoti monks. So that's an opportunity to make merit. And I'd say that's also why things like the Poi Sanglong are so important, because it's their one opportunity to kind of go to the monastery and have a more engaged experience in giving donations and making merit for themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Perhaps if there are none, then I will turn this over to Kate to give the word of thanks on behalf of all of us.
I better do it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olivia, for this very interesting talk. You really have unpacked what has been a mystery for me. And can I also thank Jyotika, who I know has been reading these texts with you and unpacking some of this history as well. So it's really, really shed light on something that was really was quite a mystery. And congratulations for managing to do all this research and to have by chance, because of the ordination, gone early to fieldwork, so that you've still managed to make huge progress in your PhD despite the pandemic and the lockdowns all over the place. Thank you, Angela, for chairing, and also P for co-organising this. So we'll have our last talk then of the series, of the After the Rain series, on the 16th of July, after which we'll be moving back into the rainy season period, and we're just thinking about how we're going to celebrate Wassa this year. So our last talk in the series will be Tony Scott on the Melinda Punha and the 5th and 6th councils in Myanmar. Thank you, Olivia, again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Olivia.
Thanks.